It was Carl Jung, the founder of analytical psychology, that showed us that libido is much more than sexual energy. It's a life energy that enables us to develop and to integrate the process of individuation. And we draw on a very special part of the unconscious, the collective unconscious, archetypes. Welcome to The Art of Therapy, Season 3, Episode 3.
Welcome. We're back in our studio, and just to continue on the art of therapy.
Yes, we are. What a journey.
What a journey indeed. So just to take a step back, so in our last episode, we really started to add to our lenses. And like we said the last time, is with every lens that we add, then if we have them, then we truly have an integrative approach. So from our last lens, we really started to have a look at Freud and his amazing contributions to the field of psychotherapy, and really understanding how complex human beings are, and also what an important role the unconscious plays in mental health as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm. Yeah, his work was foundational. It's easy to consider that there's ways of adding and developing, and of course we'll explore that. But the work that he did really was exceptional, and the fact that he could conceptualize the mind as really an iceberg, and with a very big part of our functioning at a level below conscious awareness, the unconscious, and begin to explore its role in our day-to-day functioning. Wow.
It really is remarkable.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
We also say that there's so many other theorists and psychologists that actually added to the field of psychotherapy. And one of the people that really made amazing contributions and worked very closely alongside with Freud was Carl Jung. And that maybe we can start to explore just his lens and his understanding a bit of his contributions as well.
Yes. Yeah, Carl Jung brings an additional dimension to the psychoanalytic approach. And it's helpful just to reflect on Freud and just to contextualize, because what Carl Jung would add is an additional, more expanded development. But the main thing in understanding Freud is that really what he did was consider the sexual part of life. He put a lot of emphasis on libido as a sexual energy. And today, when one looks at that, it does look like a strong emphasis, and it was a strong emphasis. But it was a strong emphasis because it was the context in which Freud was working. At the time, in the 1800s, the late 1800s and 1890s, those were the Victorian times. And he was in Vienna, and the Victorian times really emerged very strongly within Britain, but it still translated into other countries, other societies. And so the society context in which Freud was working and treating was one where it was this Victorian overture with a very strong emphasis and a prohibition on sexual expression. And this was especially so for women. So what Freud was actually beginning to recognize in those that he worked with, that very often some of their difficulties, a number of their symptoms or difficulties, and often hysteria, did relate or seem to relate in some way to some guilt, some conflict around their healthy expression of sexual needs, sexual energy, and that very often the difficulties they had were symptoms of these unexpressed desires, these conflicts. that related to early childhood. So it really was the focus then of bringing sexuality and giving it a voice, beginning to express it in a time where it was not permitted, very restrictive, especially for women. And children were largely seen as asexual as well. And so Freud began to highlight this area, not because of a special interest necessarily or preoccupation of his. It was more that he was linking that very often those who were distressed psychologically, when he was working with them, there would be some connection with a deeper conflict, often some sexual conflict going back to early childhood.
I think it's so important to actually note that, because it's the era that he lived, it's the era that he was exposed to, and that is what was relevant at that time.
Yes.
And that's what he observed. He was actually very keen in observing and making sense of it at that stage.
Yes, he really was a clinician, and he was connecting these symptoms and psychological difficulties with something much deeper that was very difficult for people of the time to talk about or articulate. And that formed the basis of his theory.
Now, I know then Jung then joined Freud in getting to know this and getting to know the psychoanalytic approach. So if we can maybe go into that then, and seeing just how they connect.
Right. So if we look at Carl Gustav Jung, he was a Swiss psychiatrist, and he worked very closely with Freud. He was really considered a protégé of Freud. He looked towards Freud and he learned rapidly. And really, his work, if we just look at it, Freud's work began in the 1890s, went into the 1930s, spanned that 40 years. And we really see with Carl Jung from about the 1910s up to 1960. So we see an overlap, but some different areas of development and also society evolving. And really what Carl Jung identified was that if we look and explore libido, and Freud had looked at it largely in terms of a sexual lens, it was Jung who began to say, but now there's other aspects to libido. And Jung conceptualizes this as more of a life force, a life energy. And this life force and life energy was around self-realization, transcendence, giving expression to one's potential, the process of individuation, and becoming more of oneself through integration, balancing of opposites. It was this life force. And so he expanded the idea of libido, that it's not simply or oriented only around a sexual energy, around sexual instincts and drive, but it's a general life energy, a life force that takes us forward. And he had set this out beautifully in his work in 1912, Symbols of Transformation, where he really put on record that the libido has a different and an additional expression, the life force energy.
It was truly an expanding part of psychotherapy. It was acknowledging the libido and the sexual drive, but also saying that people are more than that. And it's expanding on that, and that there's other psychic energy that actually drives people and to assist them in self-actualizing.
Very much. And that's so much easier for us to recognize that today, because to a large extent, the society that we're in, and societies, because each society and each country is different, but there's much more room for sexual expression. there's much more understanding. Having said that, we kind of go through, it's like a pendulum that moves from one side to the other. The 70s were probably a time of even more open sexual expression, more comfort in expressing sexuality. Today, we've got much more graphic images, graphic exposure with pornography, accessibility, but that's not the same as sexual openness, being able to talk freely, more comfortably and to others, and to express these parts of ourselves. So we're certainly a long way off, and we've really come on since the 1890s. But it is, to some degree, a time where there's more openness, but also it is more conservative in various ways. But by and large, we've come a long, long way. So the idea then that we can consider the libidos is not only a sexual energy, but now consider as a life energy, a life force, is really would fit with where we are today, how we understand ourselves, how to understand the society we're in, and a little bit more about life.
Psychotherapy is not only a profession, it's a state of being. And for that, it requires continuous learning, training, and refining your skills. If you would like to become better in your role as a psychotherapist, come and join Dr. Warwick Phipps for in-person training at Treatment Work Centre, where you will experience training like never before from a thought leader and expert in psychotherapy. If you would like some more information on our training or to book a training session, please visit the link in the description. And also, if you find these podcast episodes meaningful, please subscribe to The Art of Therapy. It really is an expansion of it.
Yes.
Yes. If we just look at Jung further, is that he made a lot of contributions, and if we maybe go into a bit more of him and what was his, just a bit more detail about him, and how he saw human beings and how he made sense of human beings.
Yes, the beauty of Jung is that not only had he expanded the understanding around libidos and this life energy and force, but he realized that there was even more to the unconscious. And he recognized that if we just consider the unconscious, that there's two major parts to the unconscious. He described that there's a personal unconscious, which is more akin to some of our deeper instincts, emotions, and things that are more difficult to express directly. It can also be trauma and certain instincts. So the personal unconscious. But then he said we have something called the collective unconscious. And that's really our archetypes, these primordial, these beginning of time symbols, expressions of humanity, common to humanity. Something of how the soul unfolds and expresses itself across humanity through time and through the individual's development. And so he recognized that there was personal unconscious and this collective unconscious. And that was remarkable, because he was now saying, okay, so we've got ego, yes, and that's that sense of I and who I am to each of us. But we have this unconscious, and it's the personal, and those are our individual, our subjective experiences. And it's often a place where we've had strong emotions or experiences where we have certain complexes, that idea of an inferiority complex or a mother complex. And Jung was saying these relate to our interaction, our experiences that are often at a level below conscious awareness and are there as these complexes. But then we have this other reservoir, this collective unconscious, this that's guiding us unconsciously, and is the expression across humanity of who we are and how we take on life, this reservoir of the collective and conscious.
I think that's just beautiful, because it adds a layer of complexity of human beings, so that we're not just individuals, but we're also impacted by the collective.
Yes.
And the humanities experience and societies that we live in as well.
Yes.
The human beings are it's not just the individual, but it becomes part of society as well.
Yes. And this opened up such a deeper understanding of people, human beings, and also created room therapeutically, because one wasn't always having to go back in time to make sense of earlier childhood conflicts in terms of sexuality, and necessarily framing them as something that needed to be immediately reduced or just bring them into awareness. That has its place. He was beginning to conceptualize that there's integration. So, for instance, if someone was struggling and there was some very strong emotion attached to a mother figure, if the consideration was perhaps there's a mother complex, maybe there were early experiences for the individual as a younger child associated with their mother, and it was painful, either rejection or abandonment. This would present as some strong emotion. It was being expressed unconsciously as a complex and influencing behavior. One working analytically with Jung's analytical psychology could both bring that into awareness, that complex, but then consider that and contrast that with, say, a mother archetype. And what does that archetype mean as in terms of nurturing, care, love, and for instance, contrast these as part of working through conflict and integrating. So it was just remarkable, because you just got this reservoir of this collective human experience.
Mm. And it's beautiful to see that, and how someone can then assist a client who has this conflict, in essence, between the collective and their personal experience.
Yes.
And then how to bring that into conscious awareness.
Yes.
But then also being able to work through it, and that there's an integration around that.
That's it. That's the beauty of his approach and his thinking, extending Freud's work and creating a very meaningful way of going forward in therapy, one that was very positive, one that's looking at individuation and becoming more of the self. And the way that he would look at it is he looked at some of the main archetypes that we all carry. He called it the persona, the social mask that we have, that we present to the world around us. But if we identify exclusively in such a limited way, that can limit the expression of who we are. Then he explored the shadow and identified the shadow, those unconscious parts of our functioning, some of the parts that we repress, our drives, instincts, things that we consider undesirable. And that if we keep that only in the shadow, what he said is that then one of the defense mechanisms, but not simply just a defense part of giving more expression to who we are, we begin to projection. And therefore we take those so-called undesirable traits and aspects of ourselves and project them onto others. Now that can be amazing as a safe way, as beginning to see it. But if we never recognize some of those are actually traits of ourselves, then we can't integrate meaningfully. So what he was saying is that we have to begin to understand the shadow, our own shadow, and begin integrating that. And then he said that we've got another archetype is the Anima, Animus. For men, the anima is identifying with more female energy and sexuality. And for women, the Animus identifying with more male energy, male sexuality. And really what he was saying here is that once one can understand aspects of opposite, because none of us are just primarily male, female. We've got different ways of expressing ourselves, different parts. And so he was actually saying, connect with other parts of ourselves in terms of femininity or masculinity, and what that brings for integration, but also creativity, not getting stuck in one part of ourselves. So exploring that. And then finally, what he said is we have the other archetype is of the self, and that archetype is integrating opposites to transcend and to become more of who we are. And it brings balance, wholeness. So the self is all about the self archetype over time that each of us give expression to in our lives is more about wholeness, the parts together and the expression of a whole.
Mm-hmm. I think that's just, it's beautiful to hear that, and that human beings, again, are so complex, and it's all these different archetypes, and how to integrate these opposites,
Yes.
to create wholeness, so that there's not conflict, but wholeness in it.
Yes. And that's the beauty of it, that it is so forward-looking, so creative, meaningful. It opens all sorts of new ways forward. And what it meant in psychotherapy, as it remains today, is that sometimes when you experience difficulty, one doesn't need to be scared or assume that it is necessarily harmful or pathological. Jung actually considered any challenges we face, like it's a very typical midlife crisis, or feeling down or depressed, perhaps not clinically depressed, but feeling down. Anytime we register these are invitations to get to know ourselves better. It's the call to adventure, to balance, to get to know ourselves, to integrate. And he would say then that part of that and that journey in psychotherapy is understanding that persona and beginning to recognize it. That doesn't define us completely, beginning to explore a little bit of the shadow and integrating that so we're not just projecting, exploring very creatively Anima and Animus and our sexual energies and the way we express gender, and then beginning to look at ourselves in terms of wholeness, our imperfections, our flaws, but what we mean is whole individuals. That's the call to adventure, and it shows we needn't be scared. And what it shows us today is the role of psychotherapy now in growth, in development, becoming more of who we are, which is amazing.
It really is amazing, and it's beautiful to hear that invitation, and it's not so threatening. Actually, it's not bad. It's an invitation for wholeness.
Yes, indeed. And one could just reflect quickly on his approach, how it informed art, literature, and one of the famous books, The Hero's Journey, by Joseph Campbell. That's really all around the hero and the archetype, and how we face this call to adventure, how we often put it off or ignore it, but life keeps coming at us until we take on that adventure.
Yes.
And we learn the skills, or we face what we need to. We have that sense, and this is all part of some of the most exciting work done in psychotherapy.
It's beautiful to hear you just explain it like this and to put everything together. And I think that it makes me so excited about just continuing with this. And I'm really excited to look at what we're going to cover in our next episode, of just adding more and more to these lenses just seeing how psychotherapy developed and where each part fits in,
Yes.
and how each part just makes more and more sense of human beings.
Indeed, it's so stunning because it's all around lenses and developing multiple lenses, extending lenses, and then what we're able to see more and more as psychotherapists, as therapists, with a great desire to help others.
Yes. Okay, till next time then.
Yes.
Thank you for joining us on The Art of Therapy. If you found this episode meaningful, or if it expanded your knowledge, we would love to hear from you in the comments section. We are looking forward to continuing this journey with you. Until our next episode.